The cabin had never been loud, flashy, or demanding. It sat where it always had, tucked between tall pines at the edge of the lake, weathered but solid, the kind of place that looked like it belonged to the land rather than occupied it. Long before manicured lawns, uniform mailboxes, and laminated HOA rulebooks appeared, the cabin had already been there, watching seasons change, watching ownership shift, watching progress creep closer year by year. For decades, the land around it had been quiet. Then the development arrived. The neighborhood rose quickly, as planned communities often do, with promises of tranquility, property values, and shared standards. Roads were carved, docks installed, and a parking lot was paved near the lake, so residents could access the water without walking far from their homes. Signs went up declaring private property, rules were posted, and a homeowners association formed with a board eager to enforce order. From the start, the cabin didn't fit their vision. It wasn't on their registry. It didn't follow their architectural guidelines. Its paint color wasn't approved. Its porch railings weren't uniform, and it certainly didn't display an HOA-issued address marker. To the board, it looked like a mistake that had somehow slipped through the cracks. To the residents, it was a curiosity at first, then a nuisance, and finally, a target. The cabin's owner rarely drew attention. There were no parties, no loud generators, no disruptive behavior. The place was used quietly, respectfully, often empty for weeks at a time, but its presence alone seemed to irritate the association. It reminded them that not everything around the lake answered to their authority. That irritation slowly hardened into something else. The HOA board began discussing the cabin in meetings. At first, it was framed as concern. They talked about compliance, zoning clarity, and community image. Someone raised the question of whether the cabin even had proper access rights. Another wondered aloud whether it was technically trespassing on community-adjacent land. The language grew bolder with each meeting, and soon the cabin was being described not as a neighbor, but as a problem to be solved. No one from the board reached out to the owner directly. Instead, letters began appearing, first vague notices about unauthorized structures, then warnings referencing HOA bylaws the cabin owner had never agreed to. The letters cited rules that applied only to HOA members, but the board treated those details as inconveniences rather than barriers. In their minds, the cabin existed within their sphere of influence simply because it bordered their development. Confidence fed their actions. They believed control of the parking lot meant control of the lake. They believed control of the lake meant control of everything touching it. And most importantly, they believed no one would challenge them. After all, the HOA had lawyers on retainer, funds collected from dozens of homeowners, and a reputation for getting its way. The eviction notice came without warning. One morning, a bright paper was affixed near the cabin entrance, citing violations, unauthorized land use, and an order to vacate within a fixed time frame. The notice claimed the cabin encroached on HOA-controlled property and demanded removal of personal belongings. It read like an official decree, heavy with authority and finality. To anyone unfamiliar with property law, it would have looked absolute. The board congratulated itself. They discussed future plans for the space the cabin occupied, speculating about a lakeside viewing area or an extension of the dock. They assumed compliance was inevitable. After all, they had paperwork, letterhead, and a majority vote. What they did not have was an understanding of the land's history. The lake predated the HOA by generations. Its boundaries, rights, and access points had been recorded long before the development was even an idea. When the neighborhood purchased parcels around the shoreline, they did so with carefully defined limitations buried deep in legal descriptions most people never bothered to read. The cabin owner had read them. Years earlier, when the land was acquired, the purchase included more than just the structure. It included lake rights, access control, and easements that dictated who could use the water and how. The lake itself was not communal. It was privately owned, with usage rights leased selectively to surrounding properties, including the HOA. Their prized parking lot existed on land that depended entirely on an access agreement tied to the cabin's ownership. The asphalt, the painted lines, the convenient proximity to the water, all of it relied on a narrow strip of land and a legal permission that could be revoked. The HOA board never questioned that arrangement. They inherited it when the development was approved and assumed it was permanent. They treated it like a public utility rather than a privilege. The cabin owner did not rush to respond. There was no panic, no angry confrontation, no immediate legal threat. Instead, records were pulled. Surveys were reviewed, deeds were examined line by line. What emerged was not a defensive position, but an overwhelming advantage. The HOA had overreached. By attempting to evict the cabin owner, they had triggered clauses that had been dormant for years. Clauses that allowed for termination of access in the event of interference, harassment, or false claims of authority. Clauses written precisely to prevent this kind of power grab. While the HOA celebrated its perceived victory, the groundwork for their undoing was already being laid. Residents began noticing small changes. Notices about lake access were temporarily suspended. Maintenance schedules were paused. The parking lot, once open and unquestioned, suddenly felt uncertain. Questions arose, but the board reassured everyone that it was routine, that the cabin issue would be resolved quickly. They had no idea how wrong they were. The lake reflected calm skies, giving no hint of the storm forming beneath the surface. The cabin remained silent, unchanged, waiting. And the HOA, emboldened by its own authority, stood on the edge of a conflict it did not understand. As the eviction deadline approached, the balance of power was about to shift, quietly, legally, and completely, setting the stage for a reckoning the HOA never anticipated. As the eviction deadline drew closer, the HOA's confidence only grew stronger. To the board, silence from the cabin owner wasn't strategic, it was surrender. They interpreted the lack of response as fear, confusion, or quiet compliance. In their minds, the outcome was already decided. The cabin would be vacated, removed, or absorbed into the association's expanding sense of control. Behind closed doors, the board began planning what came next. They discussed timelines for clearing the structure, debated whether it would be cheaper to demolish or repurpose it, and even floated the idea of turning the space into a community lookout. None of these plans included the cabin owner. None of them questioned whether the HOA actually had the authority to execute any of it. The board operated in an echo chamber, reinforcing one another's assumptions until they felt indistinguishable from facts. The residents, meanwhile, were fed a carefully crafted narrative. Newsletters framed the situation as a routine enforcement matter. The cabin was described as a non-compliant structure that had refused to integrate into community standards. The board assured everyone that property values were being protected and that decisive action was necessary. For many residents, that was enough. HOAs thrived on the idea that rules equaled security, and few people questioned the process as long as it didn't inconvenience them. But unease began to creep in. Some longtime residents remembered when the development was first approved. They recalled discussions about lake access being conditional, about special agreements that allowed the HOA to use land it didn't own outright. Those details had faded over time, buried under years of routine and assumption. Still, fragments of memory resurfaced, raising quiet doubts. The board dismissed those concerns quickly. They reassured anyone who asked that the HOA's legal team had reviewed everything. They emphasized their authority, their contracts, and their collective power. Any mention of the cabin owner's rights was brushed aside as irrelevant. After all, if the HOA said the cabin was in violation, then it must be. What the board didn't realize was that the cabin owner had already moved beyond defense. Instead of reacting emotionally or publicly, the owner worked methodically. Documents were organized into clear timelines. Historical land surveys were matched against modern maps. Easements were highlighted. Access clauses were flagged. Each piece of paper told the same story. The HOA's authority stopped well short of where they believed it extended. The most critical detail lay in the parking lot. The HOA treated it as a given, an essential feature of their lakeside lifestyle. Residents parked there daily, unloading kayaks, fishing gear, picnic supplies. It was the gateway to everything they loved about living near the water. Yet legally, the lot existed in a fragile state, permitted only through an agreement that depended on mutual respect and non-interference. By serving the eviction notice, the HOA had violated that agreement. The cabin owner prepared a response, not to the board's assumptions, but to their actions. Notices were drafted with precise language, referencing exact clauses and recorded instruments. There was no exaggeration, no threats, no emotional appeals, just facts, timelines, and consequences clearly outlined. Still, the HOA remained oblivious. As the deadline neared, they scheduled enforcement steps. Contractors were contacted, locks were discussed. The board debated whether law enforcement should be present just in case. The idea that the cabin owner might push back legally was barely considered. In their experience, resistance usually collapsed under the weight of HOA pressure. But subtle signs of trouble began appearing. A small notice appeared near the parking lot entrance, understated and easy to miss. It referenced pending review of access permissions. Most residents walked past without noticing. Those who did assumed it was another HOA formality. The board, when asked, waved it off as a temporary administrative issue. In reality, it was the first visible crack. The cabin owner wasn't trying to shock or embarrass the HOA. The strategy was deliberate and restrained. Each step was designed to build a clear record of notice and opportunity to correct course. The goal wasn't chaos, it was accountability. The HOA ignored every signal. On the eve of the eviction deadline, the board finalized its plan. They were confident enough to discuss it casually, joking about how quickly the situation would be resolved once official action was taken. They believed their authority was absolute, and that belief insulated them from doubt. That night, the lake was calm. The water reflected the surrounding homes, docks, and lights, serene and indifferent to the tension building around it. The cabin stood quietly at the shoreline, unchanged, as it always had. There were no signs of packing, no signs of retreat. To an observant eye, it didn't look like a place preparing to be abandoned. It looked like a place waiting. Early the next morning, formal notices were delivered, not to the cabin, but to the HOA itself. They arrived through certified mail, electronic filing, and official channels the board could not ignore. The documents outlined the violations committed by the HOA, the specific clauses triggered by their actions, and the immediate consequences. The most alarming detail sat buried in the middle of the paperwork. Effective immediately, the access agreement allowing the HOA to use the lake-adjacent parking lot was suspended pending resolution of unlawful interference. Use of the lot without authorization would constitute trespass. By the time the board fully understood what they were reading, residents were already discovering the impact. Cones appeared at the lot entrance. Notices were posted more prominently now, citing private ownership and restricted access. Confusion spread quickly as morning routines were disrupted. Residents who had parked there for years suddenly found themselves turned away from the lake they believed was theirs. Phones began ringing. The board scrambled to contain the situation, insisting it was a misunderstanding, a temporary hiccup, something that would be resolved by the end of the day. But the language in the notices was clear, and the legal references undeniable. This wasn't a bluff. It wasn't posturing. It was enforcement. As frustration mounted among residents and panic set in among board members, one realization began to surface, quietly at first, then with growing clarity. The cabin owner wasn't a passive neighbor they could intimidate. They were the one holding the leverage. And with the eviction deadline now meaningless, the HOA found itself facing a problem far larger than a single cabin, one that threatened the very privileges they had taken for granted since the development began. The moment the parking lot became inaccessible, the HOA's carefully maintained image of control began to fracture. What had once been a quiet, unquestioned convenience instantly turned into the neighborhood's most visible pressure point. Residents who structured their routines around lake access found themselves blocked, confused, and increasingly angry. Kayaks stayed strapped to roof racks. Fishing gear went unused. Morning walks ended abruptly at posted signs that hadn't existed days before. The board had not prepared for this. Their authority had always relied on predictability. Rules were enforced because people assumed they had to be followed. But now, the HOA was the one issuing reassurances it could not guarantee. Emails were sent out urging patience. Notices were posted claiming temporary disruption. The language was vague by design, meant to calm without explaining. It did the opposite. Residents wanted answers, not slogans. They wanted to know why the lake suddenly felt off limits. They wanted to know how a single cabin could override years of HOA dominance. Most importantly, they wanted someone to blame. The board pointed fingers outward. They framed the cabin owner as uncooperative, unreasonable, and disruptive. They suggested the owner was abusing obscure legal technicalities to inconvenience hundreds of families. In meetings, the situation was described as an unfortunate escalation caused by someone unwilling to work with the community. But cracks appeared in that story almost immediately. More residents began digging into old documents, pulling out purchase packets, disclosures, and meeting notes from when the development was first approved. Buried in the fine print were references to conditional access, third-party ownership, and limited-use agreements. What had once seemed like boilerplate language now carried unsettling weight. The lake was never fully theirs. That realization spread quietly at first, passed in side conversations and private messages. The parking lot, it turned out, was not HOA property at all. It was permitted use. Granted, not guaranteed. The authority the board had exercised for years rested on an assumption that no one would ever challenge it. Now someone had. The cabin owner remained absent from the chaos, deliberately so. There were no public statements, no social media posts, no attempts to sway opinion. The silence was strategic. Every reaction from the HOA only strengthened the record of overreach, misrepresentation, and disregard for legal boundaries. Behind the scenes, the board's confidence collapsed. Emergency meetings were called. Legal counsel was looped in repeatedly. The same questions surfaced again and again in different forms. How did this happen? Each time, the answer was the same but harder to accept. They had acted first and checked later. The eviction notice, once seen as a show of strength, now looked reckless. Legal advisors reviewed the cabin owner's filings with growing concern. The language was precise. The citations were accurate. The timelines were documented. There was no emotional argument to dismiss, no ambiguity to exploit. The HOA had violated a clear non-interference clause, and the consequence, loss of access, was spelled out plainly in the original agreement. Reversing it would not be simple. Residents began demanding accountability. Emails flooded the board's inbox. Some questioned why such a critical piece of community infrastructure depended on land the HOA didn't own. Others asked why the board had pursued eviction without confirming jurisdiction. The tone shifted from confusion to frustration, and from frustration to suspicion. Trust eroded rapidly. The board attempted damage control by accelerating plans to enforce the eviction anyway. They reasoned that if the cabin was removed, the access issue would resolve itself. It was a desperate gamble rooted in denial. They still believed force could solve what documentation had created. But the cabin owner had anticipated this. Additional filings were submitted, reinforcing boundaries and formally notifying the HOA that any attempt to physically interfere with the cabin would constitute trespass and property damage. These weren't warnings. They were legal tripwires, laid carefully and unmistakably. The board hesitated. What had once seemed like a straightforward show of authority now looked like a liability nightmare. Contractors backed out after reviewing the situation. Insurance questions arose. The risk of personal accountability, often overlooked by HOA board members, suddenly felt very real. Meanwhile, the parking lot remained closed. Each day it stayed inaccessible amplified the consequences of the board's decision. Residents grew restless. Some openly challenged the board during meetings, demanding to know why their lake access had been jeopardized over a cabin that had existed long before the HOA. Others began discussing the possibility of board removal, a topic rarely spoken aloud before. The power dynamic shifted visibly. The cabin, once treated as an outsider, became a symbol, proof that the HOA was not as untouchable as it claimed. The lake, once assumed to be a shared amenity, was now a reminder of limits the board had ignored. The cabin owner finally made a small, calculated move. A formal notice was sent to residents, not emotional, not accusatory, but factual. It explained ownership of the lake, the conditional nature of access, and the specific action taken by the HOA that triggered the suspension. The message made one thing clear. The situation was reversible, but only if the HOA acknowledged its overreach and withdrew the eviction attempt. The response was immediate. Residents redirected their anger. The narrative shifted away from the cabin and squarely onto the board. Accusations of incompetence and abuse of power spread quickly. People who had once trusted the HOA implicitly now questioned every decision it had made. The board found itself isolated. They had tried to assert dominance and instead exposed their vulnerability. The eviction notice had not removed a problem, it had revealed one. And with pressure mounting from all sides, the HOA faced a choice it had never expected to make. Double down and risk losing everything, or retreat and admit they never had the authority they claimed. As tensions escalated and the community braced for the next move, it became clear that the conflict was no longer about a cabin. It was about control, accountability, and the consequences of mistaking assumed power for real ownership. The internal collapse of the HOA did not happen all at once. It unfolded in stages, each one more damaging than the last, as pressure from residents, legal reality, and public exposure converged. What began as quiet dissent hardened into organized resistance, and the board found itself fighting not just a land dispute, but a credibility crisis of its own making. Emergency meetings became routine. Attendance surged as residents who had never shown interest in HOA governance suddenly demanded a voice. Faces that once nodded in passive agreement now stared back with expectation and skepticism. Every explanation from the board was met with follow-up questions, and every vague assurance was challenged with documentation pulled from the same files the board had ignored for years. The board's authority no longer went unquestioned. Attempts to control the narrative failed repeatedly. When the board tried to frame the situation as a temporary legal disagreement, residents pointed to the closed parking lot as proof of real-world consequences. When they claimed negotiations were underway, residents demanded timelines and evidence. When they suggested the cabin owner was acting in bad faith, the owner's quiet, factual disclosures stood in stark contrast to the board's defensive tone. The difference was impossible to ignore. Behind the scenes, resignations were discussed. Some board members privately admitted the eviction notice had been a mistake, but fear kept them silent. Stepping down now would look like an admission of guilt, yet staying meant absorbing growing anger and potential liability. The board was trapped by its own pride. Legal counsel delivered grim assessments. The HOA's position was weak. The eviction notice had no enforceable basis. The access agreement had been lawfully suspended. Any attempt to escalate could result in damages, injunctions, or personal exposure for board members who had acted beyond their authority. The advice was clear: de-escalate immediately. The board did not follow it. Instead, they attempted a partial retreat, quietly withdrawing enforcement actions while refusing to formally acknowledge wrongdoing. They hoped to wait out the storm, assuming residents would eventually grow tired of the disruption. It was a miscalculation. The parking lot remained closed. With summer approaching, the loss of lake access hit harder each day. Residents who had paid a premium for proximity to the water now felt misled. Some began consulting attorneys of their own, exploring whether the HOA had breached its fiduciary duty. The idea that the board had jeopardized a core amenity through reckless overreach sparked anger that went far beyond inconvenience. The cabin owner remained patient. No gloating, no public victory lap. Every move continued to follow a deliberate, restrained pattern. The owner's communications emphasized resolution, not punishment. The message was consistent. The situation existed because the HOA chose confrontation over verification. That restraint earned credibility. Residents began viewing the cabin owner not as an adversary but as a counterbalance, someone who had acted within the law while the board had not. The narrative the HOA had tried to build collapsed completely. Blame settled where it belonged. Pressure mounted for formal action. Petitions circulated calling for a special election. Residents demanded financial transparency, meeting minutes, and legal invoices related to the eviction attempt. The board struggled to respond. Each document released raised new questions, exposing how casually authority had been assumed and exercised. The eviction notice itself became a focal point. Residents scrutinized its language and realized how thin it was, how heavily it relied on intimidation rather than legal grounding. What had once seemed like an official decree now looked like a bluff that had been called. The cabin owner introduced a final condition. A formal letter outlined the steps required to restore access, complete withdrawal of the eviction notice, a written acknowledgement of the cabin's rights, and a revised agreement clarifying future boundaries. The terms were firm but reasonable. They offered a path forward that preserved community access while preventing future overreach. The board stalled. Admitting error publicly would undermine their authority completely. Yet refusing the terms meant continued loss of access and escalating backlash. The balance of power had shifted so thoroughly that the board's choices were no longer about control, they were about damage limitation. The tipping point came quietly. A longtime board member resigned, citing personal reasons. Within days, another followed. The remaining members scrambled to fill vacancies, but few were willing to step into leadership amid such turmoil. The board, once unified and assertive, now looked fractured and uncertain. Residents sensed the change. Meetings grew more confrontational. Calls for accountability grew louder. The idea of dissolving or restructuring the HOA, once unthinkable, entered serious discussion. The board's claim to authority had eroded to the point where even routine decisions were questioned. Still, the parking lot stayed closed. Each day it remained inaccessible reinforced the lesson the HOA had tried to ignore. Power without ownership is fragile. Rules without jurisdiction are suggestions. Authority assumed rather than granted collapses under scrutiny. As the board faced mounting pressure and dwindling options, one reality became unavoidable. The cabin owner had never needed to fight loudly or aggressively. The law had done the work. And now, with the community watching closely, the HOA stood on the edge of a final reckoning, one that would determine not only the fate of the cabin, but the future of the association itself. By now, the HOA was operating in a state of crisis, a term board members had never imagined applying to themselves. What began as a simple eviction notice had spiraled into a full-blown credibility disaster. Every decision they made, every explanation offered, seemed to compound their problems rather than solve them. The very residents who had once deferred unquestioningly to the board were now vocal, organized, and insistent on accountability. The cabin owner, meanwhile, remained a study in quiet precision. There was no grandstanding, no attempts to inflame the situation, only methodical, legally grounded action. Every notice sent, every clause referenced, and every document provided was accurate and enforceable. The HOA's overreach had created leverage the cabin owner had been waiting for, and it was impossible to counter without acknowledging the truth. The parking lot, the once overlooked artery of community life, had become the ultimate symbol of the HOA's miscalculation. Residents discovered daily just how dependent their routines had been on the lot, and that dependence translated into pressure. Conversations shifted from casual complaints to formal demands. Meetings were no longer procedural, they were confrontational and filled with pointed questions. With frustration mounting, the board attempted a partial appeasement. They issued vague statements suggesting that discussions with the cabin owner were ongoing, that access might be temporarily restored, and that the eviction notice had been a misunderstanding. But these statements lacked detail, lacked authority, and lacked credibility. Residents immediately recognized them as weak attempts to regain control. Behind closed doors, the board debated their options feverishly. One faction pushed for compromise, a formal agreement with the cabin owner that would restore access and quietly erase the eviction attempt from HOA records. Another faction resisted, unwilling to admit that the association had acted without jurisdiction. They feared setting a precedent that could invite further challenges. While the board squabbled internally, the community continued to experience the consequences of lost access. Boats sat idle, fishing plans were cancelled, and weekend barbecues by the water dwindled. Social media groups exploded with residents sharing notices, maps, and explanations from the cabin owner. Questions of accountability and transparency dominated every conversation. The turning point came when a formal deadline passed without compliance from the HOA. The cabin owner had provided a clear path: retract the eviction, acknowledge lake rights, and formalize a revised agreement. The HOA had failed to respond adequately, and the legal weight behind the cabin owner's claims could no longer be ignored. The doors of the parking lot remained closed, and the consequences of that closure rippled across the neighborhood. Pressure now came not only from residents but from the legal ramifications of the board's actions. Attorneys began reviewing the chain of events, analyzing fiduciary responsibilities, and highlighting the liabilities the board faced for unilateral decisions that directly impacted community access. The risk extended beyond inconvenience. It touched finances, insurance coverage, and personal exposure for the individuals involved. Recognizing the magnitude of the situation, the board finally took decisive action. They convened an emergency meeting with full transparency, inviting residents to attend and hear directly from leadership. The agenda was clear: address the eviction notice, clarify lake access, and outline the path forward. The cabin owner submitted a formal statement for the record, documenting every step, every legal right, and every expectation. There was no emotional appeal, no theatrics, simply a clear demonstration of the HOA's missteps and the corrections required to restore normalcy. It became undeniable: the board had acted recklessly. Their assumption of authority, their dismissal of established rights, and their overreach in issuing the eviction notice were no longer subject to debate. Residents, armed with documentation and first-hand experience of lost access, demanded acknowledgement and resolution. Finally, a decision was reached. The HOA formally withdrew the eviction notice and acknowledged the cabin owner's ownership of lake rights. A revised agreement was drafted, clarifying boundaries, reinforcing conditional access for the parking lot, and explicitly limiting the board's authority over property they did not own. The language was careful, precise, and non-negotiable, designed to prevent any similar overreach in the future. The shift in dynamics was immediate and unmistakable. The cabin owner regained full control of their property and the lake access, while the HOA, humbled by legal and social pressure, found its authority constrained. Residents who had been caught between assumptions and legal realities now had clarity, and the board's missteps became a cautionary tale about overconfidence, ignorance, and the illusion of absolute power. As the community absorbed the consequences, a broader understanding emerged. Rules matter, but only when authority aligns with ownership. Power is fragile when divorced from legality, and the lessons of one cabin, quietly asserting its rights, reverberated far beyond the shoreline, reshaping relationships, expectations, and governance for years to come. In the weeks that followed the formal resolution, the neighborhood felt different. The lake, once a symbol of convenience taken for granted, had transformed into a reminder of limits, rights, and accountability. Residents who had never thought about ownership or easements began to understand the invisible lines that governed their everyday lives. Conversations at meetings, barbecues, and casual encounters no longer assumed the HOA's authority was absolute. The cabin itself stood quietly at the water's edge, unchanged and unassuming. To most eyes, it was just another structure among the trees, weathered and modest. Yet in truth, it had become the epicenter of a lesson in power, patience, and legal foresight. The eviction notice that once seemed like an aggressive act of dominance had inadvertently exposed the HOA's vulnerabilities and forced a recalibration of authority. The parking lot reopened, but with clear boundaries. Residents could access the lake, yes, but now with an understanding that access was conditional, maintained by respect for property law rather than assumption. The inconvenience they had endured lingered in memory, shaping how they approached community rules and interactions. The lake no longer belonged entirely to the HOA, and the subtle shift in control reverberated through every decision the board made from that point forward. The HOA board itself emerged diminished, but restructured. Those who had clung stubbornly to overreach were replaced, either by resignation or by votes from residents who demanded change. New members approached governance differently, informed by the lessons of hubris and oversight. Policies were rewritten, language clarified, and the importance of checking authority against documentation became a guiding principle. Meetings were no longer ceremonial. They were cautious, precise, and measured, tempered by the knowledge that power without legitimacy was fleeting. For the cabin owner, the experience was quiet but transformative. No public celebration, no confrontation, only the satisfaction of having enforced rights carefully and patiently. The lake and the cabin remained theirs, unshaken, and the HOA's attempt to intimidate had only reinforced that position. The owner's restraint, coupled with a deep understanding of legal structures, had turned a moment of potential conflict into a demonstration of the balance between authority and law. Across the community, the ripple effects were clear. Residents became more vigilant, more informed, and more willing to question assumptions. Conversations about governance shifted from blind compliance to accountability. The lessons of the eviction notice were discussed for months afterward, not as gossip, but as a case study in power dynamics, legal leverage, and civic responsibility. The HOA itself eventually embraced transparency, introducing policies that clarified boundaries, responsibilities, and rights. Enforcement of rules became consistent with law rather than assumption. The once unquestioned authority of the board was tempered by the recognition that it existed within limits, that oversight could be challenged, and that governance required both responsibility and humility. As seasons changed, the lake returned to a calm routine. Families resumed boating and fishing. Kayaks and canoes glided across the water with familiar ease. Yet beneath the serene surface, the lesson remained. A cabin, long overlooked, had reminded a community that authority could never replace legality, and that true control is rooted not in intimidation, but in clarity, foresight, and respect for boundaries. The story of the cabin became quiet legend among residents. It was retold in hushed tones at meetings as a cautionary tale about what happens when power is assumed rather than verified, when overconfidence meets patience and principle. It became a benchmark for understanding, not just about lakes, parking lots, and HOA rules, but about the subtle, essential balance between ownership, rights, and the human tendency to overreach. In the end, the cabin remained where it always had, enduring seasons, storms, and scrutiny alike. The lake reflected the sky as it had for decades, the water's edge marked by quiet authority and unassuming ownership. The HOA's role was clarified, the residents' understanding deepened, and the lesson was clear to all who watched. Assumptions can be dangerous, power can be fleeting, and respect for law and boundaries is the strongest defense of all. The eviction attempt faded into memory, remembered not for the conflict itself, but for the clarity it revealed, the humility it demanded, and the subtle victory of quiet knowledge over misplaced authority. The neighborhood had changed, perhaps forever, and the cabin stood as a steadfast reminder that even the smallest structure can assert the greatest truth. If you liked this story, please like, subscribe, and share it with others so they can learn something from it too.